Hello, everyone, and welcome to the first edition in a brand new series called The Strategic Library. Now, during the past few years, I've done a pretty substantial amount of research for my upcoming book, and as a result, I came across a variety of different works that I found to be highly influential. Some of the information contained within these books was incredibly invigorating and really improved the quality of my life. So I thought, hey, might as well take it upon myself to go ahead and convey this information to others. The first book that I'm going to mention is going to be The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, Powerful Lessons in Personal Change by Stefan Covey. So, let's begin. The first thing that I like about this book is in the introduction, it said that you should approach the material from the role of a teacher and not a learner. And to be perfectly honest, this struck me pretty hard. In fact, this actually led to the idea of the strategic library. That's why I chose this book to begin with as my first edition. If you end up reading a book with the idea that eventually you have to convey these ideas to others, you end up retaining the information a lot better. So when you're listening to me tonight, you should really think about approaching this material in such a way that you have to teach somebody else all the ideas that I'm about to give you afterwards. And I assure you, you'll be able to remember the information a lot better as a result of that. Before we get to the 7 habits, it's probably not a bad idea to mention a common theme that occurs throughout this book, and that's going to be how you make sense of the world around you. Stefan uses the word paradigm, and by the way, he uses it rather frequently, so we should probably pin it down. Now, paradigm is originally Greek, and it means a model, or theory, or assumption, or frame of reference. It's a mental model that we end up making sense of reality with. So if you think about it, the roles that you play in society, your political and religious affiliations, the different scientific models that you've adopted, how you ended up dividing up the world around you and placed it into different categories, and that's the basis of language. Like, all these are a part of your paradigm, or your map of reality. Now, you might be asking yourself, why is this important? Why do I need to understand how I make sense of the world around me? Well, as it turns out, whether these models are correct or incorrect, they're going to influence your attitude, your behaviors, and ultimately it's going to influence every single waking moment of your life. So yeah, kind of important. The more aware we are of our basic assumptions, or mental maps, or paradigms, the more we can take responsibility for them. We can start examining them critically and eventually end up testing them against reality. It seems as though that there's a lot of people out there who don't think that they're looking at the world through these mental maps. They actually think that they see reality as it is, that they're being objective about it. But this is so patently false that it's almost comical. The way that you end up looking at the world, you're not actually seeing it as it is. You're seeing it as you are, how you've been conditioned to see that. When you end up describing something in your environment, you're basically, in effect, describing yourself. You're describing your mental maps and paradigms. But the nice thing about it is that everyone has the ability to change how they end up viewing the world around them. You have the ability to change your lens of perception or your paradigm. In fact, this occurs all of the time. People end up shifting their fundamental way of thinking whenever they're faced with, for example, a life-threatening crisis, or they suddenly see their priorities in a different light, or they step into a new societal role like they just got married, or they start having grandkids, or they become a manager of a company, or the leader of a nation. All of these are different ways that we end up reorganizing our maps of reality. In fact, every significant breakthrough that we've seen within the scientific community, like the sun being the center of the universe, or microbial interactions causing infectious diseases, so therefore you should probably wash your hands before certain operations, or all life stemming from a single organism, are ideas that were derived from breaking from traditional ways of thinking, from deviating from old maps of reality, from old paradigms. All right. I know what you're thinking. Here I've been rambling on for who knows how long, and I haven't mentioned one of the 7 habits. don't worry, I'm getting into that soon. Before I can do that, I do have to mention 2 types of social paradigms that Stefan mentioned within the book. The first one is the personality ethic. The second one is the character ethic. Within our modern society, the personality ethic reigns supreme. Within this paradigm, it says that success is a function of one's personality or your public image. It's on the types of behaviors and skills and techniques, and all of these are used to lubricate the social interactions within your environment. The basic idea is towards quick fix influence techniques and power strategies and communication skills and building up positive attitudes. So a lot of it's more of a social band-aid that we use to address acute problems, but a lot of the major implications regarding society in general is kind of left to fester under the surface. Long story short, the personality ethic reflects the outer shell of the individual. So, if it occurred to you that the personality ethic is shallow, illusory, and deceptive, well, congratulations, you are correct. If you ever attempt to get anywhere within the social system based upon a personality ethic, your results are going to be temporary at best. Eventually, people are going to see through your facade and it's going to be over. In contrast to the personality ethic is going to be the character ethic. The character ethic reflects the inner self, and it bases the foundation of success in society on things like honesty, integrity, humility, fidelity, temperance, courage, justice, patience, industry, simplicity, modesty, and treating people how you would like to be treated. During the course of writing this book, Stefan looked at 200 years of success literature. The first 150 years ended up focusing on this character ethic that I just mentioned. Only within the past 50 years has it shifted over to this social image consciousness type thinking, where it's pretty much quick fix solutions to social ailments. As I'm sure you probably guessed, the rest of the book is going to deal with a character ethic. The reason why Stefan places so much value on this paradigm is that he believes that there are principles that govern human effectiveness. When we think about the physical universe, for example, we see laws like gravity or electromagnetism or thermodynamics, and all of these are different laws that end up organizing the physical universe. And he believes that there are equally real laws that end up influencing things within the human dimension, and that's going to be these principles mentioned within the character ethic. These principles, by the way, are not values. You can think of a band of bloodthirsty pirates as sharing the same system of values, but they're still going to be in violation of these fundamental principles. So going back to our mental map idea, the principles are going to be the territory and the values are going to be the maps about what the territory is. So when you end up valuing the correct principles, or you end up building maps that end up representing the proper territory, it's going to be a little easier to navigate through your social environment. Let's take a look at the territory that we're going to be exploring. The character ethic is inside out, which basically means that you're going to be starting with yourself first, with your way of organizing reality, these basic paradigms, and your character and all your motivations in life. You're starting there. Within this paradigm, it's impossible to think that you'll have any success within the public domain if you don't first have success within the private domain. It means that you have to be able to keep the promises to yourself before you end up making promises to others. It's a task in futility to put your personality ahead of your character, to try to improve your social relationships without first improving yourself. You can't invert that process any more than you can harvest a crop before you plant it. At this point, I want to talk about one of my favorite analogies within the book, and that's going to be comparing this process to farms. Now, on a farm, you really can't cram in the fall. If you don't end up planting your seeds in the spring, and if you goof around all summer, you can't have a frenzy of activity in the fall and hope to bring in a harvest. The farm's a natural system. You have to go from one step to the next to be able to reap anything valuable. Now, the personality ethic is like cramming in the fall. It's trying to get you a handful of techniques and skills and strategies to be able to work your way within the social system, but again, you're not going to reap anything valuable because you haven't spent the time developing your character. This character, I should note, is a composite of our habits. It took me this long to finally get to the word habit. Sow a thought, reap an action. Sow an action, reap a habit. Sow a habit, reap a character. Sow a character, reap a destiny. I ended up quoting that directly from the book, and it's going to be the crux of this entire work. So let's talk about habits for a moment. Although this analogy wasn't used within the book, I do think it's rather helpful to what we're going to be talking about later, and that's comparing the mind to a piece of paper. When you fold a piece of paper, it has a tendency to fold in that crease over and over. The more you fold it in one direction, the more the paper will fold in that direction whenever it's influenced in the future. And this is very similar to our neurophysiology. There's something called neuroplasticity that basically ends up saying that whenever you reinforce a certain thought or behavior, you end up reinforcing certain neural pathways within your brain that allows these thoughts and behaviors to occur more readily, and that's going to be a habit. Although I do admit Stefan ends up approaching habits through a different interpretation. He defines a habit as the intersection between knowledge, skill, and desire. Knowledge is the theoretical paradigm, the what to do and the why you end up doing it. Skill is how to go about doing that. And desire is the motivation, the want to do it. If you want anything to become a habit in your life, you have to have all three of these components. Let's look at a habit that many people want to integrate into their lives and see how these three aspects play a part. The habit I've chosen, which is especially important within this modern Western society, is eating well. The knowledge part of this habit, the what to do and the why you do it, is pretty straightforward. The what to do involves a basic understanding of nutrition, knowing what kind of things are good for you, like fruits and vegetables and nuts and grains and other kinds of natural foods, and what kinds of things are bad for you, like greasy food and pop and candy bars and all of this other gunk that society throws at you on a daily basis. The why part of the knowledge section is even more straightforward in this case. It can be wanting to look better or feel better or live longer. Like, all of these are reasons why you want to end up taking on this habit. Skill, the how to do it, is related to how you go about procuring the types of healthy foods that I mentioned earlier. This could take the form of going to a farmer's market or organic food store, or if you're incredibly lucky, you can end up starting your own garden. That would be awesome. Lastly, desire, the motivation to actually follow through with this habit. The more you want to look better and feel better and live longer, the easier it's going to be to turn eating well into a habit. So again, a habit is defined as the intersection of knowledge, skill, and desire. That being said, the 7 habits mentioned within this book, and we'll get to them momentarily, don't worry, we're almost there, are going to provide an incremental, sequential, and highly integrative approach to the development of your personal and interpersonal effectiveness. If you end up integrating these 7 habits into your life, you'll end up noticing that you'll be moving from a state of dependency to a state of independence, and, if all goes well, you'll eventually reach a state of interdependence. A state of dependency is far more common than you might realize. It's the paradigm of you. You take care of me. You come through for me. You didn't come through for me. I blame you for my current emotional state. It's all your fault. There's a reason why dependency is at the low end of the maturity continuum. It's having other people control you and define you and use you and manipulate you. It's letting the weaknesses of other people ruin your state of mind, or feeling victimized by things that are entirely outside of your control. If you ever want to see a collection of people living on the low end of the maturity continuum, go visit a middle school. It's remarkable how easily they're manipulated by the people around them. Whether it's somebody making a rude comment or touching somebody else's property or tapping their finger on a desk, all of these little gestures end up having tremendous reactions. I've never seen anything quite like it. Although middle school kids are an extreme example of this, I think a lot of people are living on that exact same level of maturity. The next step up on the maturity continuum is going to be independence, which is the paradigm of I. I can do it. I'm responsible. I'm self-reliant. I have the capacity and ability to choose my own response to a situation. Although I said it was a step up on the maturity continuum, it's actually a giant leap forward. The moment that you reach this state of maturity in your life is the moment that you gain a certain degree of freedom. You get to take the steering wheel of your life and guide it in whatever direction that you want to, which is great and all, but it doesn't stop there. At the far end of the maturity spectrum is interdependence, the paradigm of we. We can do it. We can cooperate. We can combine our talents, abilities, and skills and create something far greater than what we can ever do by ourselves. It's important to know that life is, by its very nature, highly interdependent. If you think about the cells in your body, it contains microorganisms that are helping it power it. Like the mitochondria has its own DNA and it's a living organism within your cells, helping you out. And if you try to achieve this maximum effectiveness through independence alone, it's like you're trying to play golf with a baseball bat. It really doesn't work. It's not a proper tool. So you have to end up gaining this degree of interdependence, this ability to work harmoniously with something else. Now that we have the goal of interdependence in mind, I can finally get to the 7 habits. All right, number 1, be proactive. Number 2, begin with the end in mind. Number 3, put first things first. Number 4, think win-win. Number 5, seek first to understand, then to be understood. Number 6, synergize. And lastly, number 7, sharpen the saw. To help organize these habits, Stefan ended up placing them into 2 different categories, which is going to be the public domain and the private domain. Habits 1, 2, and 3 are going to be dealing with the private domain, which is to say that they're mostly there for self-improvement, and end up building your way up to the public domain, which is going to contain habits 4, 5, and 6. And we'll end up taking habit number 7 by itself a little later on here. So, habit number 1. Be proactive. At first glance, that seems like a rudimentary concept. Of course you have to be proactive in life. You can't just sit on your butt and hope things will end up working out for you. It doesn't work like that. You have to take the initiative. Any goal that you hope to accomplish, you have to have the discipline and the drive to go ahead and pursue it. No one's going to do it for you. Thankfully, being proactive within this context means a lot more than simply taking the initiative. For one, being proactive means taking responsibility for our lives. It means that your external conditions aren't dictating your behavior. That's a function of your decisions. And even if you look at the word responsibility, that's your ability to choose your response. Any proactive person recognizes this responsibility. They refuse to blame circumstances or their environment or conditioning for their behavior. All of those are just excuses. Their behavior is the product of their own free choices based upon values rather than being the product of something outside of themselves. To really drive this point home, the work of Viktor Frankl was brought up. He ended up writing a book called Man's Search for Meaning, and it's incredibly profound if you ever get around to reading it. In fact, I might just go ahead and add that to the strategic library list because it's that much of an influential work. I've seen it referenced in multiple books. To make a long story really short, Victor was subjected to the concentration camps of Nazi Germany. He lived in a world that no longer recognized the value of human life and human dignity, and they treated him like an object that they were going to exterminate, having planned, to make full use of him before they do so. And all of the terrible atrocities that you can possibly conceive of, he ended up having to go through that. And it was a very bleak time, to say the least. Despite the constant brutality and humiliation and suffering that he had to go through, Victor ended up finding an innate form of freedom that ends up existing between a stimulus and a response that nobody can end up taking from him. This gap is where our ability to choose comes from. It's where our self-awareness lies, in our imagination, and conscience, and independent will, and nobody can end up taking that away from you. They can take away all of your external forms of freedom, but they can never take that innate form of freedom that each human has, and that is our ability to choose. Something happens in your environment, and then eventually you're going to have to respond to that. But how you end up responding is our last primordial shred of freedom. It's little wonder that Victor sees in responsibleness the very essence of human existence. So it's not the dreary circumstances or the horrible people or the unfortunate social weather that ends up hurting us the most. It's how we end up responding to those that ends up determining the quality of our lives. If you were bit by a poisonous snake, one of the last things that you want to do is to chase it down for revenge. That's only going to drive the poison more through your system. It's a lot better to start taking measures right off the bat to get the poison out. And the same thing holds true for how you end up responding to unfortunate circumstances. Get the poison out by having your responses being based on values, not circumstances. If you can pull this off, you are going to separate yourself from the reactive people of our world who are easily influenced by the social weather that's around them. When people treat them well, they'll feel well. When people don't, they have a tendency to become defensive or protective. So reactive people build their emotional lives around the behavior of others, which allows them to be easily manipulated and controlled by these people. In contrast to this, the behavior of a proactive person is based on their own conscious choices, which are derived from their values rather than being the product of their external circumstances. As Samuel Johnson observed, the fountain of content must spring up in the mind, and he who hath so little knowledge of human nature as to seek happiness by changing anything but his own disposition will waste his life in fruitless efforts and multiply the grief he proposes to remove. That, my friends, is being proactive in a nutshell. Habit number 2, begin with the end in mind. This habit is based on the principle that all things are created twice. So we end up creating a mental blueprint of something, and this is the first creation, and then we end up turning this mental blueprint into physical reality, which is going to be the second creation. A perfect example of this principle is going to be building a house. Now, before a single brick is laid down, or a single board is cut, or a single nail is nailed into place, the design for the entire building has already been laid out. And the more clear we are about that design, and the more we end up following through with that design, the more desirable the end product is going to end up being. Now, in that example, the first creation is going to be the blueprints for the house, and its construction is going to be the second creation, or turning those mental blueprints into physical reality. Whether we choose to admit this fact to ourselves or not, or whether we're in control of it, there's going to be this first creation in basically everything we end up doing in our lives. We're either going to be the second creation of our own proactive design, which is to say that we're going to be moving towards a destination of our own choosing, or we're going to be the second creation of somebody else's agenda. In a nutshell, habit number 2 says you are the creator. You are the archetype for your whole life. If that's the case, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to build a design for our lives that we're not going to be happy with in the end. Think how absurd it would be to spend years working on the blueprints for a house and spending an even longer duration of time building it. And by the time it's all said and done and you're standing in front of your creation and you think to yourself, nope, I don't want anything to do with that. What a complete waste of time and energy. The reason that I brought this up is that there are so many people out there that are caught up in the busyness of life, that are working incredibly hard at climbing the ladder of success, only to discover, usually a little later on in life, that the ladder was leaning up against the wrong wall. So again, it's a good idea to have a clear understanding of your first creation, and to know that it's going to be something that you're going to value when you finally end up turning that idea into reality. When it comes to building our first creation, or designing our blueprint and how we want our lives to go, Stefan suggests that we should find our center. He believes that everyone has a center, though we usually don't recognize that to be the case. Not only that, we don't seem to recognize how much of an all-encompassing effect this center has on our lives. So, what kind of centers am I talking about? The few mentioned within the book are going to be spouse-centeredness, family-centeredness, money-centeredness, work-centeredness, possession-centeredness, pleasure-centeredness, friend-enemy-centeredness, church-centeredness, and self-centeredness. So each and every one of these are going to be a possible center that one can end up having within their lives. When I went through that list, did any center strike you as the most meaningful? And to be perfectly honest, it doesn't really matter which one you end up choosing, so long as the one that you do choose ends up giving you a certain amount of security and guidance and wisdom and power, and allows you to pursue your own proactive agenda with a certain amount of vigor. Once you've had the opportunity of some careful self-reflection and have discovered your center, I want you to go ahead and think about how much that center affects your life. If you think about your motivations or your daily decisions or how you end up behaving within a crowd or how you end up interpreting the events around you, you'll notice that your center plays a vital role in how you end up extracting meaning from those events. That's why it's so important to understand your center. And if your center doesn't empower you as a proactive person, if it leads to a state of dependency where you're constantly reacting to your environment and the people around you, you need to get rid of it. You need to go through a paradigm shift, and you need to find a center that ends up encouraging you to become the source of your own creation. Those individuals who really sit down and think about what matters most in their lives, who end up discovering a center that gives them meaning and direction, they end up becoming very reverent. They start thinking in larger terms than today and tomorrow. Not only that, they end up discovering an inner harmony and congruency within life a lot easier. That's pretty much what the second habit is striving for. Alright, habit number 3, put first things first. Out of all the habits, I think this one's going to be one of my favorites. The best way that I heard it phrased or surmised is going to be, things which matter most must never be at the mercy of things which matter least. And that was a quote by Goff. Take a moment and think about that sentence for a moment. Is there anything that you're doing within your life that really isn't all that important, that happens to be rather superficial and trivial, and you end up finding yourself doing it rather frequently? A few examples of these, at least in my opinion, is going to be binge watching Netflix, or obsessively playing video games, or going on Facebook or Instagram or Twitter far too often, or drinking, or hanging out with individuals that really aren't that interesting, but you prefer that over being alone, so you decide to waste time with them anyways. All of these are examples of things that don't really matter. You're really not making headway towards any specific goal at all. You're merely indulging in immediate forms of gratification. Hey, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying you can't pull the pressure release valve every now and then and do these types of activities. I'm not saying that at all. In fact, I'd be rather hypocritical if I ended up saying you should get rid of these entirely. That's not the point. The point is, when you end up discovering a purpose in your life, or having a mission, or there's a project that you'd very much like to complete, and all of these are going to be derived from our habit to first creation, where we're trying to interpret how our life will end up being in the future. Once we have a clear image of what we want, and there's this burning yes inside of us that allows us to say no to all of these trivial things, then you are utilizing the third habit properly. Alright, I admit, I didn't put that very eloquently, so perhaps an example will help out. Let's just say you were really scratching your head and you concluded that you'd like to develop some type of skill within your life. And this can be any skill that you want, but for the sake of this particular example, I'm going to use learning a musical instrument. In this case, a guitar. Mainly because the guitar is the only instrument I feel somewhat competent on, so I can actually give you some insights on how to go about learning it. So, anyways, the guitar. One of the first things that you're going to discover when you first pick up the guitar is that your hands are incredibly clumsy. There are always a few exceptions, but this is basically the norm. So how do we get past that? Well, the best answer is you need to train your body to approach the instrument. And spoiler alert, it's not always going to be fun, and it's not always going to be easy. If you want to be able to play this instrument beautifully and have an incredible time doing that, there's going to be a time where you have to muster up the willpower to do something that you don't necessarily want to do. However, when you end up looking at all of the successful people that are out there in the world, and in this context, you can think about Jimi Hendrix or Stevie Ray Vaughan or Buddy Guy or B.B. King or Slash or Tom Morello or Steve Vai or Joe Satriani. Like, all of these guys are incredibly gifted because they have the habit of doing the things that most people don't want to do. It's not like they necessarily wanted to do these things themselves, but their disliking is subordinate to the strength of their purpose. They were driven for some definite end, that goal that we were talking about in Habit 2, having that first creation that they're striving towards. That was the most powerful thing that was guiding their actions. And when you have that powerful desire, it allows you to sidestep a lot of those forms of immediate gratification rather easily. On the flip side of that, if your desire is not that powerful, if your first creation, that mission within your mind, is not sending chills down your spine, the problem is that whenever the going gets tough, it's the easiest thing in the world to step back and go ahead and do another activity. If you want habit number 3 to work for you, you have to be able to keep the commitments to yourself. Again, this is a fundamental part of the character ethic that I mentioned earlier, and it's the essence of all proactive growth. You need to be able to put your nose to the grindstone when it comes to following your first creation, or when it comes to following your mission or projects in life. The 3 habits that I talked about so far are all going to be a part of the private domain, which is to say that they're going to allow you to move from a state of dependency to a state of independence. These private victories end up preceding public victories in the same way that you have to plant a seed before you can reap anything from it. That being said, let's go ahead and move on to the habits that are going to be a part of the public domain, which are going to be habits 4, 5, and 6. We are now moving into the realm of interdependence, which can only be built upon the foundation of true independence. The first habit within the public domain is going to be habit number 4, think win-win. Before we get too far into this habit, I do want to make clear that this is not a technique. In fact, it's a total philosophy of human interaction. What win-win is attempting to do is to create a frame of mind that's constantly attempting to seek mutual benefits in every single type of human interaction. Win-win basically ends up meaning that the agreements that we end up coming to, or the solutions that we end up providing, are going to be mutually beneficial and mutually satisfying to every single party that's going to be involved. No one's going to feel cheated or taken advantage of or exploited within these types of arrangements. Everyone feels good about the decision that was made, and they're all going to be moving towards a particular plan or mission or project together. It's probably not a bad idea to note that win-win views life as being highly cooperative, and it's not some sort of ruthless competition where everybody's fighting for their own interests tooth and nail. And the thing is that when you end up having your own interests being fused with the interest of others, it allows you to pursue them a lot easier, and you can do so in a very harmonious and very intelligent way. If you find the idea of win-win to be rather peculiar, don't worry. It seems as though most people within this culture of ours thinks in terms of dichotomies. So you're either strong or you're weak. You're playing hardball or softball. There are winners and there are losers. But this kind of thinking is fundamentally flawed. all of these are based on the social pedestals that we put each other on and the power struggles that we go through, and they are not built on principle. Win-win is based on principle. It's based on the paradigm that there is plenty around for everyone. And if one person's successful, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to be at the expense or exclusion of someone else's success. Multiple people can win simultaneously, which is a difficult concept to wrap one's mind around if you grew up in a culture that always had a winner and a loser. Well, I guess there were some events I recall growing up where everyone got a participatory award, and so therefore they all won. But this is an actual situation where people can genuinely feel as though they won within these types of interactions. Before you can get into a win-win type scenario, you're going to need 3 character traits. One is going to be integrity, you'll need maturity, and you'll also have to have an abundance mentality. Let's look at each of these individually, starting with integrity. It's an essential part of the character ethic, and it's defined as the value that we place on ourselves. In fact, habits 1, 2, and 3 help us develop and maintain our integrity. In short, it's being proactive within your life, it's organizing and executing around the values that you find to be important, and it's utilizing a certain amount of self-awareness and willpower to end up keeping meaningful promises to yourself. That is integrity in a nutshell. Before a win-win type of interaction occurs within your life, you first have to know in a very deep sense of what constitutes a win, which is to say you need to know what's going to be harmonious with your innermost values. If you can't make and keep the promises to yourself as well as others, your commitments are completely useless. Win-win types of interactions are based on trust. And people are going to figure you out really soon. That duplicity, they'll sense it and they'll become guarded. And you'll never be able to have a win-win scenario work when you don't end up keeping promises, especially to yourself, because again, that's the foundation in which promises to others are built upon. So again, integrity is going to be the cornerstone for this type of interaction. Maturity, the second character trait for win-win relationships. Now, I've already had the opportunity of talking about maturity and the maturity continuum before, so I'm not going to dwell that much on it. I talked about people being in a state of dependency, and if they end up utilizing those first 3 habits, they'll end up gaining a state of independence, and if they're lucky, they'll move to a state of interdependence, which we're talking about now. In this context, maturity is the balance between courage and consideration. So if you can express your feelings and your convictions with a certain amount of courage and balance that with the consideration for other people's feelings and their convictions, you are considered mature, especially if the issue that you're both working on is important for both of you. The third character trait essential for the win-win to work is going to be the abundance mentality, which is the paradigm that there is plenty out there for everyone to enjoy. A lot of people out there in our modern society have what Stefan calls a scarcity mentality. They end up looking at life as a very limited resource. And the thing is that there's just not that much to go around. So you can almost think about all of the success in the world as being a giant pie. And if somebody gets a large chunk of it, that just assumes that the rest of everybody else is going to be fighting for a smaller bit of that. Contrary to this worldview is going to be the abundance mentality, which flows out of a deep inner sense of personal worth and security. It says that there is enough to go around. You can share in prestige and recognition and profits and decision-making. It opens up new realms of possibilities and options and alternatives, and you can be genuinely creative with other people when it comes to pursuing your goals and your interests. Onward to habit number 5. Seek first to understand, then to be understood. Out of all the 7 habits, this one is the most immediately applicable in our lives. If you have any desire to communicate effectively within a social situation, this is going to be a principle that you need to take into consideration. When most people are engaged in a conversation, they're typically looking to be understood. So they don't really listen with the intent of understanding the other person. What they're doing is they're listening with the intent of replying to that individual later. Think back to the last conversation that you had. Were you actually attempting to make sense out of what the individual was saying? Or did you spot something within that conversation that you found interesting, and during the time that they were speaking, were you formulating a reply to that idea? And to be honest, I'm quite guilty of this as well too there. When I first read this habit, I really ended up opening my eyes to what I've been doing for quite some time now. I've always wanted to have a good rebuttal or a good response or to react in a manner that's quite impressive. So I'd catch something that the individual was saying and I'd start elaborating upon that in my mind, and a lot of the later ideas that they ended up talking about were sort of lost in the midst because I'd be holding on to that idea, preparing to speak later. An unfortunate consequence of this type of selective listening is that our conversations basically become collective monologues, and we never really grasp what's going on inside of that individual's head. More times than not, we're filtering everything that we end up hearing through our own paradigms, and we're reading our own autobiography into other people's lives. As I'm sure you probably guessed, filtering everything through our own experience and through our own way of viewing the world around us is going to lead to a state of stagnation. If you're not open to other ideas, if you're not trying to see the world through the other individual's lens, you're not going to be able to catch new concepts that readily. We need to try to see the world the way that they see the world. And if we understand that individual's paradigm or mental map of the world, you can better understand how they end up feeling or how their situation is looking from their point of view. Listening with the intention of understanding is not easy and might require a little practice. But the more that you end up making that a habit in your life, you'll end up discovering that your paradigm will end up growing immensely as a result of being receptive to other people's ideas. A short while ago, I talked about maturity as being the balance between courage and consideration. Seeking to understand requires consideration. On the other hand, seeking to be understood, well, that takes courage. Because this lecture is already running a little late, I'm not going to dwell too much on how you can be better understood, but I will leave you with this tip. If you can end up expressing your ideas clearly, specifically, visually, and, most importantly, contextually, which is to say that you can put your ideas in the context of other people's paradigms and concerns, you are going to significantly increase your influence. Habit number 6, synergize. If you understand this concept properly, you'll realize that synergy is the highest activity in all of life. If you end up putting all of the habits together, synergy is pretty much what amounts from that. In short, synergy means that the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. One of the best examples of a synergetic relationship, besides the mitochondria within your cells, which is probably the best example I can probably think of, is going to be members within a band. To avoid any unnecessary confusion, let's just say that it's a high-functioning, drama-free band consisting of 4 members: a guitarist, a bass player, a drummer, and a vocalist. If you've ever been in the presence of a fantastic band, you will quickly realize that they are creating something with each other that none of them can end up doing by themselves. The bass player is articulating his musical ideas around the thump of the drummer's bass pedal, while the guitarist is primarily emphasizing the rhythmic swacks of the snare drum, and all the while the vocalist is going to be harmonizing his tonality based upon the harmonies that are resulting thereof. This is synergy. 1 + 1 = 3 or more within these types of relationships. The musicians within this example are communicating synergetically, which is to say they're opening up their minds and their hearts to all the new possibilities, all the alternatives, all the new opinions and different forms of self-expression. And to be able to play off each other's energy like that, and to be able to spontaneously adjust your playing to the improvisations of each other, I mean, we're talking about some really high-level communication here. But again, this is only one example. There are countless ways to fuse your energies with other individuals and create something far better than what you can ever do by yourself. If you want this remarkable relationship to work properly, you need to value the differences of other people. whether that's mental, emotional, or psychological. If the guitarist or the bass player or any of these musicians end up going on some sort of wild tangent that you're not quite sure of at first, let them do it, man. Again, you kind of have to trust the process, and who knows, maybe you might even come to like those variations a lot better when you have the opportunity of sitting back and listening to it. We need to value those differences because it's those differences that are going to end up contributing to our knowledge and to our understanding of reality in general. If we're left to our own devices, where we constantly end up reinforcing our own patterns of thought and not allowing any changes to occur within our own selves, we're not going to grow that much as a person. We're finally at the end. Habit number 7, sharpen the saw. I mentioned earlier that habits 1, 2, and 3 are going to be dealing with the private domain, and habits 4, 5, and 6 are concerned mostly with the public domain. Now, habit number 7 is a little different. It's actually dealing with the greatest asset that you have, and that is going to be you. The greatest investment that we can ever end up making in life is going to be investing in ourselves, because that's the only instrument that we have for dealing with life and circumstances and all the people around us. Now, you might be asking yourself, why did Stefan call this habit sharpen the saw? Well, if you think about it, if you were an old logger back in the day and you had a really long saw that you used to chop down trees, the thing is that once that saw gets dull, you can put in a considerable amount of effort into your work and yet not really accomplish all that much. So occasionally what you have to do is you have to stop work and you have to sharpen your saw, and then when you go back to it, it'll be a lot more efficient when you get there. And, if you think about it, we are the instruments of our own performance. And if you want to be effective, you need to recognize the importance of stepping back occasionally and sharpening the saw, which is going to happen in 4 different ways according to Stefan. And that's going to be pursuing your physical, spiritual, mental, and social and emotional side of your nature. Let's start with the physical domain, which is going to primarily concern ourselves with taking care of our body. That means eating the right kinds of foods, making sure you get plenty of rest and relaxation, and exercising on a regular basis. And by the way, a good exercise program is going to involve improving your body in 3 different areas. That's going to be your endurance, your flexibility, and your strength. The mental domain is going to concern itself with improving the quality of our minds. It's quite unfortunate that the vast majority of people that are out there, the moment that they step out of school is the moment they allow their minds to atrophy. Their attention has been manipulated for so long by teachers and textbooks and busy work and really anxiety-ridden tests that they really have a distaste for the educational process. As a result of this attitude, they really don't do much for serious reading, or they don't explore any new subjects to any real depth outside certain fields, and they're not all that analytical, and most of them refuse to write, especially in a critical sort of way where they're attempting to express themselves creatively in a clear and concise language. Nope, instead what they'll typically do is opt out to watch television or Netflix, or to binge play video games, or all of these different forms of immediate gratification. This, by the way, is taking the easy way out. Stop wasting time with frivolous activities and start improving your mind. Read good literature, listen to different lectures, start doing a hobby of some variety, painting or drawing or picking up a musical instrument. Anything, do anything that'll end up improving the quality of your mind. And this, by the way, will not only enhance your life, but it's going to enhance the lives of all the people around you. Next, it's going to be improving the spiritual side of our nature, which is at our very core, or that center that we talked about before. And it's going to be our commitments to our value systems, whatever they may end up being. In short, this is going to be the source that draws us to the timeless truths of humanity. And again, this is going to be different for everybody. This could take the form of going to church, or sitting in a mosque, or meditating in a temple, or even walking through the woods can bring about these types of spiritual experiences. And And lastly, the social and emotional dimension of our nature, which is going to deal with our interactions with other people in our environment. Renewing this dimension within ourselves does not take time in the same sense that renewing the other dimensions does. In fact, we can improve upon this side of our nature within our normal, everyday interactions with other people, but it is going to involve some work. As Goethe once put, treat a man as he is, and he will remain as he is. Treat a man as he can and should be, and he will become as he can and should be. That statement is a wonderful summation for improving our social and emotional side of our nature. Thus concludes the 7 habits of effective people. If you had as much fun listening to these ideas as I did talking about them, go ahead and click the subscribe button below. There are going to be plenty of topics ahead, so you don't want to miss them. See you later.